One of my 2024 goals is to pull together my thoughts about why I think Matthew was written in Hebrew in hopes of trying to submit a paper to a scholarly journal in 2025. As I've been collecting my thoughts, there are side points that keep coming up that don't really have any bearing on the original language of Matthew, but they're kind of important in their own right. One of these is the idea that Matthew misused the Old Testament. The YouTube channel What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You has been interviewing biblical scholar John Walton lately. I'm a big fan of Dr. Walton, and a little jealous that Zach Miller gets to interview him. That's the choices I made though. I'm not set up to interview anyone because I'm generally not interested in interviewing people. In a recent video, Dr. Walton discussed a little bit of what is going on with Matthew and Old Testament prophecy. He brings up that the futurist/skeptic understanding of a one-to-one correspondence between the event predicted and the event that happened isn't what's in the author's mind. They never really did get as far as saying what is in the author's mind, though. One thing I'm going to put out right at the front is that there's a fair amount of discussion regarding this. If your pastor has told you that these fulfillments mean something in particular that's at odds with what I'm saying, it's not worth picking a fight over. If you find my explanation compelling and others in your church don't, just keep your head down. It's not worth losing friends over. Another thing I need to say is that I once used the one-to-one correspondence understanding of fulfillment. I was raised in late 20th century America. Fulfill is not a word that we use a lot in the here and now. I've never heard anyone say that they fulfilled a prediction. As someone not raised in church, the only reference I had to give me the usage were cartoons and sitcoms. It's not a surprise that I would have a wrong understanding of what it means to fulfill a text. This was one of the problems that I had when I first started to examine the New Testament. Matthew has a lot of fulfilled Old Testament texts, and it's clear that he's not applying the grammatical historical method to find these fulfillments. Many of them weren't even predictions in their own context. When I first looked into the text of the New Testament, this caused me to doubt the reliability of Matthew as a thinker. I still held it as a historical witness, but that's it. Then there's the quote wrongly attributed to Zechariah, and the fact that the Hebrew original seemed to have been lost, and I was ready to put Matthew on the side as uninspired. When my prayers for guidance were answered by leading me to discover that the Hebrew text of Matthew might never have been lost, it caused me to re-examine everything else that I thought about Matthew. That is probably the most important thing I have to say about seeking out the meaning of fulfilled. There are a lot of people, like me, that have had an intuition that there's a problem with the understanding of fulfilled as one-to-one correspondence. For me, the deeper intuition was that a lost original text was a problem. I didn't just stop at the idea that there's a problem, though. I looked for the conversation about it among majority scholars, then minority scholars, and then went beyond them. Along the way, I learned things that were major challenges to my base understanding of Scripture, inspiration, and preservation. None of these new things were controversial. I learned that I started with a naive understanding of these things, and the deeper understanding I grew into had much more support than I thought. So if you have an intuition about fulfillment, explore it. If you don't find what I say here compelling, keep exploring. Coming back to the fact that exploring this issue caused me to rethink how I look at the history of the church and the relationship between the church and the Bible, it's definitely worth noting that the one-to-one correspondence understanding has been a dominant view in the church since very early on. In Justin the Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, he repeatedly appeals to the virginity of Mary and the prophecy in Isaiah 7 verse 14. The method that Justin used would be incompatible with what I've found. There is an idea floating in some circles that the first thought you have about what a Bible text means is what that text almost certainly means. There's another thought that the most common understanding of a text is what that text almost certainly means. I personally have never found these ideas to be helpful. Both of these need to be considered very deeply and heavily, but they're places to start your study, not where your study should end. It has been my experience that often the most nuanced examination of a topic is the more accurate. Not always, but often. And it's worth taking a moment to recognize the difference between nuance and complication. If you really feel that these are the problems that bother you the most, build a more nuanced case than any of those that say it's not a problem. That's not really why you're here, though. You're here to get the answer to a pretty straightforward question. What does fulfill mean? I'm not the first one to notice that the Old Testament references in Matthew aren't strictly speaking predictions, and yet the idea of one-to-one correspondence is early and often in hermeneutics. This leads to a lot of speculation about what else fulfill could mean. That's the problem with language, though. Any word could mean anything. So once I had the thought that I was approaching these sections wrongly, my quest was to find out what it does mean. This is further complicated by the fact that there are at least a few places where the one-to-one correspondence of prediction to historical event does seem to be in view. For example, when describing his prediction of the fall of Jerusalem in Matthew 24 verse 34. These are certainly the exception, but whatever I found had to be compatible with this. The Greek word is
Iro.
plera, and the Hebrew word is malo.
Mala.
The most basic meaning of both of these words is to fill up. Like, they fill up the nets in Matthew 13 verse 48. It's the same word. It can also be used to refer to running the course of time, like in Genesis 25 verse 24, the time of the pregnancy is fulfilled when a woman gives birth, or in Genesis 50 verse 3, when the mourning period is past. Another thing that I found fascinating is that this word was never used for a prediction coming true in the Old Testament. In fact, the more common way to use fulfill in regard to God's words is to say that God has kept his promises. For example, 1 Kings 8 verse 24 and in Psalm 20 verse 5. I can easily see how that kind of fulfillment would morph into a correspondence between prediction and event, but that it very specifically didn't start there is interesting. It's also interesting that some of the more obvious Old Testament predictions don't get mentioned in this way. The Proto-Evangelium in Genesis 3 verse 15, for example. So instead of seeing these fulfilled passages as predictions, they're seen as something more akin to promises. The texts in question aren't always promises, though. I think an example of what I think is going on might be helpful. When I was a kid, one of my favorite stories was The Three Little Pigs. When my wife and I were engaged and shopping for a house, there were a few houses on the list with brick portions. My dad fully expected that to raise the status of those houses for me. It would have been predicted by my natural affinity for the story. Me buying a brick house would have been seen as an action filled with a story I enjoyed as a child. Looking at fulfillment this way, a lot of the texts in the Gospel start to make much more sense. For example, in Matthew 2 verse 15, Matthew quotes Hosea saying, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." Hosea 11 verse 1, if we apply the grammatical historical method, is a reference to Israel leaving Egypt. However, if we think about fulfillment as events that feed on the emotion or structure of a text, this feels much closer. There's more to this than just a theoretical understanding of the gospel message, though. This isn't an apologetic to get the gospel authors off the hook. If this were the only application, I'd just keep it to myself. There's something much deeper to this. This cuts exactly against the grain of the modern historical grammatical method of hermeneutics. There is a certain value to the historical grammatical method, and I wouldn't want to push against that unless I was offering something that I felt had equal or greater value. When we see how Matthew used this passage from Hosea, we see that Matthew sees hope on Jesus' homecoming. The Exodus isn't just a moment in history. It's not just something that God did way back then way over there. It's something God is doing. It's who God is. So when I read about Moses being afraid to speak to Pharaoh, and someone else being chosen to be his voice, that's me and God. I don't speak well, my thoughts wander, and I'm not the one to stand up and say what I need to say. I've gotten very comfortable with the role of saying things that need to be said quietly to the people that can carry the message forward. When Elijah has to run away even after defending God and even after calling fire down from heaven, I've seen that in people, and had to take a step back and think whether this really is a person of God. This has been the way that the scriptures have been approached most often through history and across continents. It wasn't until the Enlightenment in the 1700s that people started looking for another way to interpret the scriptures. This might have had something to do with the advancement of physical sciences and an attempt to create the same kind of case for God and morality that we make for physical realities. I have always found it an interesting casual observation that the physical world is best described through mathematics, and attempts to describe it poetically always fall short, but ethics is best described poetically, and attempts to describe it mathematically always fall short. There's a certain mental rhyming between the Exodus and the Holy Family returning from Egypt. We should embrace that. I realize that it feels less certain than the way that some others try to approach the text, but as I've applied the text to my life this way, it's surprised me how little controversy comes from this. There are vanishingly few cases where someone can honestly put themselves or those they interact with in both a heroic and a villainous role for the same set of actions. This is also why I don't have so much problem with the idea that the biblical authors played fast and loose with the historical details. I'm not primarily looking to them to tell me what happened. I'm primarily looking to them to tell me what I should do next. If they're willing to fudge the number of years someone lived or how far it is between cities or whatever to make that point better, that's the point I'm more interested in inspired scripture for.